In the last video, we looked at how liberal ideas could both help make a world a better place or make a mess of things, depending on your perspective. Now let's talk about what it means to be a citizen of a liberal society. There are rights and responsibilities that go with the freedoms all Canadians enjoy. But first, what is a citizen? Some see citizenship as a personal attachment to your nation state, like patriotism. You could be a global citizen or a citizen of your town. Others see it as merely a legal definition, with documents to prove you legally belong somewhere. Well, let's look at those legal definitions. Some nation states have different ways of classifying who is allowed to be a citizen. For example, Canadian and American citizenship is usually based on birth. You automatically get to be a citizen if you're born here. It's known as jus soli, or right of the soil. The issue with this is if a child is born in Canada but the parents aren't Canadian, should that child still have all of the rights and privileges other Canadian citizens have? That would include protection by the Canadian government, even if the child is not living in Canada. There are other nation states like Greece where citizenship can be based on bloodlines. You're a citizen regardless of where you live because it's based on whether your family has traditionally been a member of that nation. It's called jus sanguinis, or right of blood. The issue with this is there could be people who want to be a member of your nation but can't because they don't have the bloodline. For example, in the past, Germany had this policy, so it was very difficult for foreign workers to apply for citizenship. And most countries today will allow immigrants to apply for citizenship. That's called naturalization. One issue with this is the idea of dual citizenship. Can you really have a loyalty to more than one nation state? That was an issue for Canada a few years ago when we rescued Canadians from a civil war in Lebanon at the cost of millions of dollars. But when the war was over, many of those dual citizens went back to Lebanon. Another issue could be if we're at war. My grandfather was called up by the Italian military to go serve, but he was also a Canadian citizen and decided to stay here. So what are your responsibilities as a citizen of a liberal society? Many see citizenship as the agreement to serve each other, to morally support your fellow man. That could include something as simple as taking responsibility for ensuring your neighborhood stays clean. Your responsibilities can also be seen as your rights. You have the responsibility to respect the law, but you also have the right to be treated the same as anyone else under the law. You have the right and the responsibility to vote. You have the right to dissent and are encouraged to do so in a civil manner. There are many issues that need to be addressed in our communities and around the world. You're encouraged to participate in the political process in order to advocate for yourself and your fellow citizens. You have freedom of speech and assembly in order to do that. For example, we've talked about the lobby group MAD that has the right to pressure the government to implement laws relating to making the roads safer. So while you should follow the law, you should also try and change it if you think there's a problem. And it doesn't take a large group with a lot of money to make a change. The Pink Shirt campaign started with just a small group of students in Nova Scotia who wanted to stand up to bullies, and now it's practiced across Canada. There are many great examples of citizens dissenting in order to advocate for a better society in both liberal and non-liberal societies. For example, in the Ukraine in 2004, the people protested a rigged election. The winner, Yanukovych, had stuffed ballot boxes, threatened supporters of the more liberal candidate Yushchenko, and it's actually believed he was behind the poisoning of Yushchenko. But Ukraine was no longer a communist dictatorship, and the people knew they had the right to stand up to this fraud. So they came out in the thousands wearing the colors of Yushchenko's party. That's why it's now known as the Orange Revolution. Within weeks, the government was pressured to hold a new election with 12,000 international election monitors. 500 of them were Canadian. Yushchenko won the election, and the people of Ukraine had stood up for a liberal democracy. Little footnote though, the people of Ukraine became impatient for democracy to fix the problems with their nation state and ended up voting Yanukovych's more communist party back into power in 2010, and there's international concerns with electoral fraud in the country, so it's not all perfect. In Myanmar, also known as Burma by the people who refuse to recognize the dictatorial junta that changed the name to Myanmar, there's also a movement to demand greater democracy. Monks have quietly marched down the street to protest the repressive government, despite the threat of violent attacks from the police. People are speaking out against their government. Activists like Aung San Suu Kyi have patiently put pressure on the government. And recently, we have started to see some small changes. In 2012, the government allowed an election to be held. It was only for 40 seats out of 440 in the House of Representatives, but it was enough to encourage many developed nations to lift some of the economic sanctions and restore diplomatic relationships with the government of Myanmar. Another example we've already talked about in the previous unit is apartheid, where protests both within the country and internationally pressured the illiberal South African government to end their racist policies. Now, that doesn't mean South Africa is a liberal utopia today. There are still serious issues with race relations, and there are too many scandals of government officials abusing their power. But things are much better for the majority of the population today than it was under apartheid. And don't forget the anti-war protests. While the protests didn't immediately bring an end to the Vietnam or Iraq wars, the people put pressure on their government to find a way to get out. Canadians also put pressure on their politicians to keep the promise of ending the offensive or fighting mission in Afghanistan by 2011. As of 2012, we do still have troops in the area, but they're there to help train the Afghan soldiers and rebuild the country. But of course, there's always the question, what's the limit? Many would agree that the anti-gay protest by the members of the Westboro Church at funerals is inappropriate. But what about the two American athletes who won medals at the 1968 Olympics and raised a black-gloved fist to support the Black Power movement? Because the Olympics are supposed to be apolitical, which means no politics, they were suspended from the team and sent home. While some saw their actions as offensive, others saw it as brave because this was during the Civil Rights Movement and African Americans were still fighting for equality. Does citizenship mean you have to be willing to fight for your nation state? Is that a responsibility? During World War II, Canada had to use conscription to organize enough soldiers to be successful against the fascist powers in Europe and Asia. That obviously took the rights away from those who didn't want to fight. Oh, but wait, there were people who were able to avoid being conscripted. For example, pacifists or conscientious objectors can apply to avoid being drafted because of their beliefs. For example, religious opposition to war. You know what really impresses me are the people who are willing to fight to protect my freedoms, including the freedom that I can decide I don't want to fight. During World War II, many Aboriginal and Japanese Canadians chose to fight in the war, despite the fact that they didn't have the same rights and freedoms as other Canadians at the time. They were fighting for rights they didn't have. So what do you think are your responsibilities as a citizen of Alberta, Canada, the world? What motivates you to take action? And how do your answers to these two questions demonstrate your ideology?